Streaming 24/7.
24/7.
Bold Moves Radio.
Bold Moves Radio.
Afrika, nakupenda sana. Oh, Afrika, nakupenda sana.
Here we go once again, as we promised last week in our attempts to speak to your guest that you looked forward to, and we couldn't for some reasons, and a promise kept. As we said, we are here this evening with our guest Sydney Baloyi, and I'm not alone. I'm with my co-host Moses NGOBENI, and once again, thank you for tuning in, and look forward to what will be a great show. Consider what happened last week as a blessing in disguise, because I believe now we are more than prepared than we were last week. Good evening, Sydney.
Good evening, my brother MANGANYI, and good evening to my other brother Moses NGOBENI. I'm very glad to have a second bite at the cherry.
Yeah, indeed, we all are. Auntie NGOBENI?
Well, I'm very excited to be here again with all of you. If I could say one thing though, if we were to be voted in as leaders of this country of ours, we would be setting a very good example right now, because now we've made a promise come to pass, a promise that we made just a week ago. You can only imagine what more we can achieve. But anyway, that's something to discuss another day. Our listeners, we welcome you once again to our lovely show. This is Love SA, where we continue to ask those pertinent questions. What are you doing in your own corner, in your own space, to make that difference for your country? Because for us to build this country, we need to be doing something at our own time, at our own space, without feeling any pressures. But we welcome you once again. We hope for a wonderful show tonight. Sydney, we welcome you, our brother. We are so excited to have you with us tonight.
Once again, we need to be more grateful to Sydney, because if anybody on whom this show is anchored tonight or this evening, it's Sydney. He made a promise on air that he is really available to be back with us at the earliest convenient time. And tonight, rather this evening, it is that convenience time. And once again, my brother, don't only do it to Love SA through Bold Moves Radio, do it to anybody else that you interact with. If anything that we lack today, it's keeping of promises. And as NGOBENI indicated, it has become typical of our politicians, but I know they are listening, most of them, and they should be taking a lesson or two to see to it that a promise should always be a promise kept and nothing else. And that's how we kickstart our edition of our beautiful show. Love SA is a patriotic movement. We don't do it alone. We do it together with you, our listeners, through our platforms, YouTube and Facebook page. You know that by now where to get us from. And once again, Sydney, you are such a guest that if one has to throw a question at you, always has to scratch one's head to find out exactly where do I start. What a journey. First question that I maybe throw at you is, broadcasting is such a seasonal career. Many do not last that long, but now we see you over decades. You are still here and very much relevant. What is the secret behind your relevance to airwaves?
Thank you for the question. There's actually absolutely no secret at all. Because from day one, I treated broadcasting in an extremely honest manner. I approached it as I literally jumped from one enclosed career environment to broadcasting. And the one before broadcasting was teaching, which allowed me to be exposed to a classroom of maybe 30, or back in those days, it was around 40 learners. So when I got an opportunity to move on to broadcasting, I treated it as another classroom, only that this time it was a classroom with hundreds of thousands of audience members at a time. So I never treated it as, you know, an exclusive treat that some people may see as, you know, a license to celebrity status. I treated it as an extension of my community responsibility, which I still continue to do. And that's the reason why, when we could not take this particular episode to its envisaged end last week, I really felt bad, and I promised both you and NGOBENI that I will make myself available for us to do this. So to get back to your question, the secret is that there is no secret.
That's an interesting one. And I must say, or rather confess, that I deliberately put that question. In me putting that question to you, I was just putting the proverbial horse cut before the horse. And a teacher, it's always a teacher. I can see that logic naturally falls in, that you decided that, you know what, I can't talk about broadcasting before I talk about where I come from. Actually, it reminds you of the song that wherever you go, by Master KG, remember the road that leads you home. And now the versatility that you have shown, I'm not jumping forward, much forward, but it's so interesting to see that from teaching, you went into broadcasting, and that goes to the versatility that one look at as one of the strong attributes you have. What is behind this, or what makes it this versatility so smooth for you? Because I'll go on to ask you about this versatility again when we look at your movements between radio and television, but now between your classroom and broadcasting, what makes it so easy for you to make these movements?
So there are many ways through which I can answer a question like this, but for the benefit of the duration that we have on air for this program, I'll try and simplify it in this way. Everybody, wherever you are, whoever you are, one of the strongest intrinsic elements that you need to cultivate in you or about you is to have a spirit of, you have to be inquisitive. Even if you don't pronounce the things that you are questioning, you still have to question them in your silence. And that is how I self-taught myself right from the beginning. I have questioned myself. I have questioned people around me. I have questioned the systems that have ruled or governed the way I move around, the way I pronounce my thoughts, or the way I just live my life generally. And over time, if you allow yourself to grow that spirit of being an inquisitive person, you become a social equilibrium in your environment. So everywhere you are, people can ask you not necessarily about what you do for a living, or not necessarily about, what you studied. They can ask you about anything. And because you have cultivated that spirit of being an inquisitive person over many years, it allows for you to become someone that is like a social equilibrium, as I'm saying. You can answer things about politics, you can answer things about religion, things about education, things about general life It's just that I happened to be that privileged to have a platform in broadcasting that I was able to answer those things in a public platform that allows for many people to engage onto. But as we continue with this conversation, you will probably establish how I was even able to successfully cultivate that, inquisitive spirit about me as a person.
So, Ngobeni, that's Sydney for you, and telling us that being inquisitive is one of the pillars that accounts for his successful versatility in whatever that he gets into. And Ngobeni, what do you think about this? Yeah, it's a beautiful show, I must say. A lot seems to be coming our way and our listeners or viewers' way.
Well, Kalanga, so far you've said a mouthful. I can't help but just sit and listen to you as you flow and the usage of the language. And I have to say it's very much interesting. I'm one particular person who loves reading. I spend most of my time reading. Sometimes it takes me away from my work. But on that very note, I want to bring our listeners into knowing who Kalanga is. When did it all start? We know Kalanga as the Wanza High School English teacher. The next thing, Kalanga jets off to the US. How did it all start? How does one high school teacher in some known place in South Africa jets off to the US? Now he comes back starting off a radio broadcasting career.
So, in fact, we need to know, starting from that village that somebody has on his or her mind, because I mean, someone of your generation, when we look at you, we think of a village at a far-flung area somewhere, in one of the darkest corners of our country. What is that darkest corner from which Kalanga comes from and grew up to who he is today?
Thanks a lot, Ngobeni, and thanks, Manganyi. Now, I come from a village called Merwe A. It's a cluster of 3 villages. So I'm stressing the A because they go up to C. These villages are on the border of the most northern part of our country, just in the Malamulele area. It's villages from which if there was a gate directly into the Kruger Park, it would take me 5 minutes to drive from my village of birth into the Kruger National Park. So I spent my formative years in that village. And most of the things that I'm sharing with you, although they seem modern and they seem progressive and they seem quite dynamic and drastic, I actually developed them whilst I still lived in that village at a very young age. Ngobeni was asking about my sojourn into countries such as the United States of America and my formative career such as teaching. So I obviously grew in the time when young people in villages such as the one that I'm talking about, our view of life, especially in terms of careers, was extremely limited. We didn't even have career education in our schools because the people that taught us, some of them were not even qualified. That unfortunately includes my own mother, who was my teacher in primary school. I only knew she wasn't qualified many years later. And
interesting.
So people like me ended up, becoming like solo travelers in terms of ambition. Because a lot of things that you wished to become, a lot of things that you wished to do were not things you could be mentored into doing them or into becoming from the people that you were looking up to in the classroom. So after going through my mandatory primary school level in Merwe, I went into secondary school, Aka Mdidid, which is even closest to the Kruger National Park. I spent 3 years at a high school called Mdidid High School. It was just a junior secondary school at the time.
Well, nifumela khalanga ku vakamtititi vana hina lan'wa va yingiserini loko va avakona nipfumeleni ya hakelanyana ti-bills na ti-bills leti fanelaka ku hakela mo nyika minutes ntsena
Absolutely.
After this break we continue from that note.
There we go. And I see when I look at Ngobeni's eyes that there's that burning question or follow-up question he wants to pose to Kalanga. And I know if I don't let him carry on with that, I'll be in trouble. And my executive producer as well, it's like, let him tell us, share with us and pose that question to Kalanga.
Well, in actual fact, Kalanga, I'm going to give you this time to continue taking us through your high school into your tertiary studies. I don't want to be on the bad side of our listeners today. We need to pamper them in one way or the other, make up for what happened for the technical glitches that we had this past week. So carry on, Kalanga.
So, yeah. So I spent the period that every young person spends in high school at an area called Madonsi. And this was the time when South Africa was going through a very turbulent period with civil and student unrest, especially in major cities such as Johannesburg. Even though I'm mentioning Johannesburg, I had never been to Johannesburg at that time, so I didn't even know what Johannesburg looked like. But I'm mentioning it because a lot of parents who wanted their kids to pursue high school education in major cities such as Johannesburg, Pretoria, and others, they sent their kids away to former homelands such as Gazankulu, La Hina Hanyako. So if you came to my high school, Shingwedzi High School, it was actually a celebrity high school in that you would find that it was almost 60% dominated by students from urban areas, students from major cities such as Johannesburg. And some of the well-known families send their kids there. I know for a fact when I went to Shingwedzi, the famous Sono family anchored around the legendary Jomo Sono. They had a few of their kids who were there. And the famous musician Chico Twala was also a student at the same high school. I didn't exactly study at the same time as him. I went there just a year after he left. And several others. So I'm mentioning this background because being at a high school like that enabled a young Sydney Baloyi who had just come out of looking after goats in Merwe, where the only extramural activity, it's something I participated in a lot.
Yes, I'm listening with much interest.
Every single day until I learned something without being taught by anybody. Because there's a day when I fought with a guy my age, a Merwe, and I floored him down. So I'm the eldest in my family. And you'll understand why I'm mentioning this. After I floored that guy down, his elder brother came. Loyi, obviously, I floored him down also. And then his older brother, who was probably old enough to be almost my father, he came. I also floored him down. Their father was working in the mines in Johannesburg, so he wasn't there to come and help. It comes to that. But somehow, in my young childish mind, I noticed, that was not the life. Because there's a cousin of theirs who was even much older than all of us, who came and he beat me to a pulp. So when I had long recovered, the first thing I learned was that if you live your life through might, you must just know that there will always be someone who can be more physically stronger than you.
That's very profound.
That happened to me. So I kept asking myself or questioning myself, what else can I do with my life other than Ubash Bagel? So when I found myself at this celebrity high school that I'm telling you about, I discovered that there were various levels of sophistication that people could aspire to. The guys that I met there were sent to our high schools. There were high schools like Giyani High School, Chingwezi, Orobelani, Banguna, the mighty Banguna High School. They had the kind of students that I'm telling you about. The reason was, during that period of student unrest, parents who wanted their kids to continue studying, their only choice was to send them to places like ours. And that allowed people like me to establish, there is another layer of life. And I started observing and I started aspiring. I remember on Sundays, these young guys would be wearing very beautiful clothes and playing jazz, playing rhythm and blues from the United States of America, music I had never heard of. And they would be telling us that that's how they live in Johannesburg, where they come from. And as I have already said, those were years long before I even knew what Johannesburg looked like. So a lot of things started forming in my mind as far back as then. And I'm sure we can get to that as the conversation flows.
Okay, this is a Love Essay, and we do that through Bold Moves Radio. We are with Sydney Baloyi. And Kalanga, from what you are saying, especially about the status of your high school, Chingwezi, and others of that status at the time, would one be correct to say that back then, the discipline that appeared to have been prominent with far-flung rural schools like Shingwezi, which has now been commodified, it's what accounts for the poor performances at public schools, especially from rural areas, because you come from such a rural based school, and here you are. We now describe you as somebody who has always been inquisitive, with insatiable hunger for everything that was happening around you. In fact, you are a product of who you surrounded yourself with, and that also goes to show us that these places, different as they are, that we come from, you have contemporaries that came from Johannesburg. You are at a rural school. You learn something from them. They came to your school to learn something. Would you say what has led to the state of affairs as it is at our public schools, which appear to be shadows of their former glory?
Okay, that's a very difficult question you've just posed. I have not stayed long enough in the education ecosystem of South Africa to speak with authority about what has led to the decline or the demise of the authority that our high schools back in the day were famous for. But I do know that the same thing that is happening in our schooling system has penetrated other areas of human activity across the board. All I can tell you is that from my observation is that the people, our forebears who fought for our liberation, fought a great fight, which is why in 1994, we were able to inaugurate the first ever Black president in South Africa. But somehow, I think we adulterated the entire playbook that they must have had from day one when they were fighting for our freedom. There's quite a lot that we seem to have strayed from, which is why in literally every sector, you can find people who will tell you that things used to be better. And that is a very controversial comparison, because when people tell you things used to be better, automatically it sounds like they are yearning for the return of the good old days. And the good old days in the South African context means the days when we were told when you can go out of your house and when you cannot, when you can leave your neighborhood to another neighborhood and when you cannot. So let's have another another session. I would like us to explore this one a little differently. For now, let's just park it.
Okay, agreed.
You have my views, which may stray us completely out of what you've asked me to discuss today.
Let's not go back to Egypt. I get what you're saying. And to carry on, Sydney, moving from a classroom of about 34 to 40 kids to a classroom that covers the entire nation, that spreads out to the rest of the world, that must have something to do with love that we have for people, and in particular in the context of our discussion, South Africa. Would I be correct to put it that way to you, that over and above everything else that has been driving you, love for what you do, love for what you want to see happening in the country, it's one of the key factors that account for your long-term in this industry, particularly media space?
Absolutely. You couldn't have put it any better. So I'm going to share something quite briefly, and I want to do it so briefly that it does not stray us away from what you have curated as the track for the discussion. When I was appointed as a teacher of English, and by the way, I insist on calling myself a former teacher of English, not a former English teacher. Because in my view, an English teacher means a mother tongue English person who is a teacher, and they may not even be teaching English. But a teacher of English can be anyone, as long as they are skilled in teaching a language called English. So when I was first appointed as a teacher of English at a high school called Shkangoma in Merwe, the principal was a former teacher of mine in high school at NTSHEMBO. His name is Gabriel Mahlale, and absolutely, dynamic and, very open-minded South African. I asked him if I could have a workshop with the students that I was supposed to teach. And he seemed surprised, but he allowed me to do it because it had never happened that a teacher walked into a school and asked to have a workshop. And of course I did have—
I'm actually surprised too.
So if you are surprised, you will be very interested in hearing what that workshop was all about. So the long and short of that workshop was I needed to have a pact. I needed to have an agreement with the students I was tasked to teach. They were grade 12 matriculants, and the deal I made with them was that they should allow me to teach them as I was hired to. But in my agenda, I had decided that 50% of the things I was going to teach them were not things that were going to help them pass matric. And if they agreed on that deal, they would be on to a very, very great journey, because I was prepared to teach them things that they would take with them for the rest of their lives. I don't exactly know, I'm not sure if they knew what it meant, but unanimously they all agreed that they were happy with my proposal. I could go on and teach them things that would not help them pass matric. If their parents had been in that workshop, I think I would have been fired on the very same day.
Absolutely.
So the first thing we agreed was that I had studied the power of language. And anybody that can impose their language onto you, they will make it easier for them to decide which direction you take. South Africa, some years ago, teetered on a brink of demise because the Afrikaners insisted that all students had to learn their subjects in Afrikaans. We thought they were crazy. I still think they were crazy, but there was logic in the craziness. The logic is, if you can make people speak your language, it will be easier for you to determine what direction they take. And that is why half of the world speaks French today, and the other half speaks English. So the first thing we must admit is that we have the first thing we must admit is that tanihi Vatsonga and many other languages. We have lost out in that war, your language. If you want people to buy your story around the world, you must pitch it in English or pitch it in French. Depending on where you are, maybe you can pitch it in Portuguese, but English, French are predominantly the leaders on the language front. So that in itself created what I call language footprints. Language footprints meaning rim learner blah blah. How far can it travel? How far can it take me? I'm a very language loyal person. That's why in my house, you will find books written by Xitsonga authors, including MANGANYI himself.
So that's it, our viewers, that's our listeners, that in case you didn't know, it's true. I agree, I'm an author with 4 books in my names.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
but Sydney, if I may cut in there.
Yes.
Sydney, if I may cut in there, you see, one of the greatest mistakes we have made in this show is to invite someone like Sydney, because he spends a lot of his life, if not virtually all his life, behind the mic, talking to people, and he's talking to us today. He forgets that we need to take a commercial break, and at this point, we'll just pause there, take a commercial break, and when we come back, he will try, I trust him, in less than a minute to get to the point that he wants us to pick at with the line is taken.
Absolutely.
And we seem to have some glitches with our commercial break. And Sydney, you can just proceed in less than a minute to pick at the point that you are headed to.
Okay, so as part of the workshop I had with my students.
With that workshop?
Yeah, many years ago. I spoke to them about the footprint, meaning the geography of a language. So, Xitsonga leshi mina nangona xivulavulavula, and the same Xitsonga that my student spoke. We try to analyze the footprint ya language liyago. How far can it take them? And the truth of the matter is, the footprint ya rimleria yintsongo swinene. So much as it's important for us to preserve it and celebrate it, I advise them that we must use another language to try and infiltrate the world. And I've been hired to teach you that language, which is English. And if you can become proficient in this language, you can go from here to Pretoria, to Johannesburg, to Cape Town, and beyond the borders of our country. I still meet a lot of those students. They are in various fields now. We joke about how they didn't exactly understand, but they remembered exactly what I said. And many years later, they appreciated that I tried to indoctrinate them into embracing a foreign language. Because even though English was called a second language, in our environments, English was really a foreign language. Because machuden, they were only exposed to English for 30 minutes a day. You can't call that a second language. Because after that 30 minutes of being taught English, everything reverted back to our own language. So, and it wasn't stuff that I had been prepared also by anybody. So I was just really plunging into the dark or into the darkness of this thing called life that we have to try and grapple with. And it worked in that those students believed that what I was telling them was the only thing they should do. And I told them, the only way to understand a new language is to speak it. You can't just read it in silence and think you will become good at it. So we started making it a habit. You know, we spoke in English with my students, and I spoke Xilungu swinene. Now, I'm not teacher, but as with everything else, over time, you become confident and eventually become really good at it. Yeah.
Well,
You know what? If I may say something, comment on what you are just saying to us at Sydney, that was going an extra mile. And the question that one would have is, it's a rhetoric question, of course. You need not answer it. It's how many of us in our different spheres of work or activities that we are engaged in on a daily basis really go that extra mile. And those that go, the few that do go, like Sydney, one cannot describe that in any other way other than to say that is patriotism at its best. And LAVSA is about that. It's a patriotic movement. And Sydney, thank you for being relevant to the theme of our program. And let's make our attempt again to see if we can take our commercial break. Okay, that's how we come back from our commercial break, Sydney. If I may carry on, just to wrap up on that line of what you have been saying to us. So one will be correct to say that Sydney is one of those that can be described as an embodiment of democracy. If back then, because we know that it came into a media space sometime early in the 90s, so his teaching happened before that. So if you could allow students to exercise a choice on how they wanted to be taught, that deserves a round of applause. And we say to you, Sydney, you are indeed relevant to our theme, because that could only have been done by somebody who bears love for the country.
Thank you. Thank you. That's absolutely true.
And NGOBENI, we say bana ba munhu ba tsemana nhloko ya njia I ri ni ku tsemela nhloko ya njia ka Baloyi ka nkarhi lowu.
Yeah, leyo njia NGOBENI.
Leya ka Baloyi loko hi la ku shekelana yona hi nga jabusiki ngikwazi ukuvulavula ntiyiso, because as we continue listening to you, there's so many things that pop up, and I believe our listeners from wherever they're joining us from, they want to know more, a bit of this, a bit of that. But for the sake of time, obviously, we'll have to channel how the show goes. Anyway, Kalanga, now we see this English teacher who has now turned into, and allow me to call you a household name, who has packaged himself so relevant in the media space. If I were to marry the two, the English teacher at first, with all the experiences that you've gathered thus far, and now into the broadcasting, or rather the media space where you find yourself in now, how does your background as your English teacher, how did it shape you? How has it positively influenced you to the Kalanga that we know today, the Kalanga that we constantly listen to when we are in our cars moving from point A to B in the comfort of our own homes as well?
Okay, so it's great. It's great that you've asked that. As a teacher of English, by the way.
An important one, not to be missed.
Yes, yes. I knew, you know, the task of getting someone to embrace a new language, it's a very, very difficult one, because naturally, the only way kumunanga donda rimirincha, ikuba atswariwa aka environment leyi ku vulavuriwaka ku ririmi rero.
Correct.
Yeah. Kumbe atswariwa wherever, mara mi n'wi susa mi n'wi yisa ka environment leyi ku vulavuriwaka a particular language, which is why munhu wo tswariwa hi Vatsonga vambirhi, loko mo n'wi teka mi n'wi yisa a Japan, a ri na 2 days avuton'wini ntsena. Loko mo n'wi landa munhu yaloye after 10 years, mi ta va mi landa muJapan, a mi landi Mutsonga. Because language is a function of orientation. So mina, as a teacher, I knew ku andondisa vanhu lava va nga Vatsonga and va kule ka environment ya Xitsonga. So, which is why I keep insisting ku English was not a second language, it was a foreign language. So it required a lot of tricks for me to make it matter. I think Magoda walava ku tatisa swin'wana.
Okay, Sydney, let me bring in some elements of dictatorship here. We cannot be doing justice if we spend so much time in the English class. You spent a couple of years in the classroom, but you spent decades over the airwaves. And can we now move to the airwaves? Now, when you get to the airwaves, you started with a big T, that then Radio Tando, the English wing of it, because I know, as a matter of fact, that they had the vendor version of that radio. How did you make that move from the classroom into the airwaves?
So interestingly, I was hoping you don't ask that question, because the response has got some controversies around it.
And I know it, and I must say, I know the controversy. In fact, as an attendant, viewers and listeners know that I'm an attendant. As an attendant that I am, and I can't run away from it, even on all airwaves like we are now. I ask you a question to which I've got an answer, but I need to share that answer with the viewers and the listeners.
Okay, but let me go ahead and answer. So, in the former South Africa Shankar Wakona, it was called a Banana Republic, Venda, because
yes,
South Africa so kuva na segment ya vanhu and then ka tiko leri ri nga bohiwa hi tinketan ta apartheid va ku va tshunxekile. It was laughable. A va nga ri voxe, a ku ri na Bophuthatswana na yona yi ku yi tshunxekile, Transkei na yona yi ku yi tshunxekile, mara a va nga tshunxekangi vanhu valavo. But in that Banana Republic independence, ava pfumeleriwa ku va endla swin'wana leswi a swi nga tolovelekangi. One of them was to start radio stations leti ava ta tirhana hi xitayila xa vona. So Bophuthatswana started Radio Bop, Venda started Radio Toendo, the big T. Switichi sweswo a swi haxa hi xilungu. I think the idea ku va va haxa hi xilungu va fanele ku va attracta listenership from tindhawu to tala leti a ti ri outside of their borders. And I think it worked to an extent because a station like Radio Bob became the University of English Language Black Broadcasting. And Radio Toando followed suit. They attracted people that they believed could anchor their English service and give them some measure of respect in a way. So when I left my teacher training at the NGOBENI, I went to audition for a job at Radio Toando. I tried my best. I did the best I could to show them that
In the circumstances.
here I am. I'm a potential new voice that can help you achieve what you are trying to achieve. But for some reason, they just turned me down, which did not break my heart because I was a qualified teacher. I already had a job. So they turned me down. I just continued doing my job as a teacher. Now, as fate would have it, I got selected by the United States of America through their education office in Pretoria, which is housed inside the embassy of the USA. It's called UNISYS. UNISYS stands for United States Information Services. They were looking for teachers in South Africa who were teaching English as a second language, which I was, that they could take to the United States to spend time there at one of their famous universities and try and equip them a little more in understanding the techniques that were required to teach someone a new language such as English. So I went for those interviews and I impressed the panel. The panel was all American because they were the sponsors anyway. And that's how I ended up going to the United States of America in the early 90s. Strangely, when I came back, I got a message that someone from Radio Toando came to ask when I was coming back, because as soon as I land, they have a job for me. So I realized the ultimate interviews.
Like as you just put it, as fate would have it, perhaps that breakthrough, and then he was to start again. But well, on that very same note,
I like
on that very same note, Kalanga, allow me to pop up a question here on your arrival to the USA. How was the feeling like? I mean, in the early 90s, you are landing in a completely new country that you only see on TV. I don't know when South Africa went to what's this, color TV, but probably you're still watching USA on black and white. And now here you are jetting off for how long? 18 to 20 hours flight. Now, Jara Gaza, really America. What was that feeling like?
That feeling was.
And especially when we look at the fact that by then he knew almost nothing of Johannesburg, his own city in the same country that he was born and raised in, but now, as fate uses his words, lands in the US.
Yes, yes.
Interestingly, NGOBENI, thanks for asking that question. I've got something I need to share with you before I get direct to your question. Loko ni a secondary school style there were annual trips. Leti machuden I fosterwa ko heteteka. One of them a airport yala Jone. I buru Jan Smuts airport in Karwako. I remember refusing to go on any of those trips, especially to Jan Smuts airport. And my reason was because abaku loko mfika le mitavona swihahampfhuka loko swi fika la na loko swi suka. So I remember my answer for refusing to go on those trips. I said, I want to see that place the day I have to use it. I don't want to go and see that place. So, true to form, the first time I saw OR Tambo Airport, which was Jan Smuts Airport at that time, it was the day I was supposed to leave for the US. And to answer your question, I was quite excited about the experience. It was quite palpable. I was sitting I still remember, it's many years ago, but I was sitting next to a guy from Australia. And Australia, Sydney. So when I introduced myself, it was quite an icebreaker. The conversation started there. And when he discovered I was in an aeroplane for the first time in my life, and I was leaving my country for the first time in my life. I was sitting, America, at last year, you're cheaper. Kuna stulu swinharhu. Kuna stulu leswi nga a fastereni, na leswi nga xikarhi, na leswi nga la a phachisini. So I was sitting right in the middle. So that guy said, if you are flying for the first time and you are going overseas for the first time, maybe I must give you my seat. He was sitting on the window. So we changed and he offered me the window seat. All I remember is I never slept that night. So all I remember was America. So I stayed awake the whole night.
My goodness.
Yes. And I didn't except the darkness, but it was quite an experience. And when I arrived there, I discovered, other countries had experienced, a lot of free movement and free ideas much earlier than South Africa. Kuna swo tala ngopfu leswi a ni nga swi tivi ku swi kona la avuton'wini leswi ni nga swi observe na ku swi discover loko ni fika ka rona tiko leriya. I remember one of them. There is a movie called Cry Freedom. A film leyi yi nga endliwa hi vutomi bya Steve Biko. I had never watched that movie in my own country. I watched it in the US, and guess what? I watched it again in an American church. They were showing Cry Freedom, and I was there. Suddenly, I had to understand, the full spectrum of the kind of country I was coming from by watching a movie that was focused on the life of a freedom fighter that could have contributed so immensely in the advancement of our own freedom and eventually our own democracy, but was sadly killed by the same system that hoped they could stay in power forever.
So that's ironic, Sydney, that you flew out of your country and you got to be taught of the pains that were directed to you in your own country on a foreign soil.
Absolutely.
More about Sydney and his journey when we come back from the commercial break, and we'll try to compress as much as what he has for us this evening. So by the time we come to an end of our show, you would have more than what you expected in a way that we try to mitigate for what we denied you for in our previous attempt to speak to him.
And perhaps before we jet off to the break, just like Kalanga jetted off to the America in one of those good years that marked the cutting teeth of his career. I should indicate that our producers, executive producer, Pastor Strike Mangani, technical producer, Messi, they borrowed us a few minutes, so they should not come as a surprise to our listeners, basically paying back for our sins, which are not necessarily of our sins of last week. So we still have Kalanga with us for a couple more minutes and more on what he's busy sharing with us when we come back from this break. Producers, we appreciate this thoughtful gesture. Welcome back once again to this lovely evening. The program is Love SA on Bold Moves Radio. We are here with our guest, the legendary Sydney Baloyi. We call him Kalanga today. Well, that's what it is. I'm not alone. I'm with my host, Mr. NTSHEMBO MANGANYI. Kasahala Pintambeni in Pastor Strike Manganya, our executive producer. Messi, our technical producer. We still appreciate them once again for borrowing us a couple of minutes for just to extend this show and make up for time lost last week and what most of you, our listeners, would have likely enjoyed the time with Kalanga. Well, Kalanga, you were taking us through just before we went to the break on your arrival to the US. And I'm tempted to ask Kalanga, but forgive me. Having spent now some time in the US being trained into what you are today, would you say your time in America has kind of systemized how you think or how you approach things, particularly in your line of work?
Yeah. So I think the time. Thank you, NGOBENI. I think the time I went to the US, which was in the early 90s, it was the beginning of a compression of time. And when I talk about compression of time, it will shortly after that, the World Wide Web, internet, and so on. Literally, the entire world becomes a small village. It does not matter where you are. You can be sitting in Mepe, you can be sitting in any other village in the world. You can be on par with anybody who is anywhere. So that in itself, it's actually a great development about our world and about our life, because you do not need to get into a plane and fly for 24 hours to America to be able to engage with anybody in that part of the world. You can become a major contributor to any community, to any society, from wherever you are. As long as you have something critical to offer, it does not matter where you are. It's quite an advantage that I was able to, visit places like that, because it just helped me to fill in the gaps already under Nadona, either from listening or from reading, because those are the two things that I do full time in my life. I listen a lot and I read a lot. So if I read about, peaceful resistance in America led by people like Martin Luther King. Being in America allowed me to visit physical locations where those things happened. But at the end of the day, it's very true. It allows for anyone to contribute anything to anybody, anywhere, without having to leave the comfort of your home. And that's exactly how we are doing this broadcast. Because 20 years ago, would have needed to get on the road and travel to some studio somewhere.
Okay, Sydney, from my patriotic heart, I've heard a lot about the US, and I don't want to speak more about US than we have already done now. I need to talk about my country with you and what you have been doing and you continue to do. I want to bring you back home. When you left US back to South Africa, what is that one thing that you said to yourself that if anything, I'm taking this with back home for my people to make my contribution as a citizen of South Africa in your space, which subsequently turned out to be the media that you remain in to date?
Yeah, so thanks, my God. So Matikyo Fana Nava US, they are considered as part of the first world. And the reason why they are called that way is because they have allowed themselves to transition a lot earlier than Matikula Aburuaku, the third world. And they have allowed they've allowed themselves to accommodate, opposing views a whole lot earlier. When I was in that country, I was based in a university called Ohio University. It's one of their oldest universities, and it's one of their most prestigious. You get an opportunity to attend a lot of lectures and symposiums, and you even listen to world leaders who visit that country, because most of them are bound to come past Ohio University. So when I came back, straight to your question, I had already admired the way free worlds or free countries can question, interrogate, and can be allowed to show if they doubt something without having to worry whether they will still be alive the next day. So when I came back, it's something that I continued, in my quest to better myself, even up to this day. When I operate, whether it's in a work environment or in a social environment, I always question, people's motives. I always question, people's views, and I always insist on having my own views as well to be put on the table and to be judged. Because if you don't allow for your views to be judged by your equals, you will probably, run off on a tangent for the rest of your life, thinking that you've got something that can make the world, when actually what you have is yeah.
So traveling to the US, Sydney, has in other ways helped to broaden your horizon in how you look at things and in how you interact with people. But other than the US, if I may also throw in your African experience, and in terms of numbers, I know you travel in Africa. How many countries did you travel to in Africa, and how they have helped to shape you to be the Sydney that you are, a household name that you have become?
Okay, so the last time I checked, the The last time I checked, I had traveled to over 60 major cities around the world. And among those, there is a good number of African countries or African cities. For instance, I've been to cities such as Accra in Ghana, Abuja in Nigeria, Lagos also in Nigeria. I've been to Cairo in Egypt. I have visited places like Uganda, their capital city, Kampala. I spent some weeks there. And because most of these countries, I went there on work assignments, it did allow me to interact with the locals and help me to establish very interesting insights about our fellow African countries. And I'm saying this because Africa as a continent, it's hugely disadvantaged in that we are like serious disjointed segments of the same half. If you go to Europe, there are a lot of things that make it easy for you to understand how Europe functions. One of them being the ease of travel. You can be in 5 different European countries in one day, just because there are bullet trains that you can have breakfast in Italy, have lunch in Paris, and have dinner in the south of France, all in one day. Yeah. Mara la akaya in Africa, for you just to go to Zimbabwe, you need 2 days sometimes. To go to Morocco, you need to first travel to Europe and then connect from Europe back to Africa. So each time I've found myself in an African country, I have really, really appreciated it. I've actually treated it as a privilege because shatika ku connecta na matiku kuloni yala Africa, and hinkwaswo is the result ya vusweti bya tikonkulu ra Africa na leadership ya tiko ra hina ra Africa. And the reason why I'm saying leadership is because there's still a lot that our leaders in Africa need to do to try and integrate the peoples of this continent to see themselves as one. But over the past decades, a lot of our leaders, unfortunately, loko va nghena switulwini va rhangisa ngopfu timhaka ta xikhwama na ku dya na ku dyela. If you look at Kwame Nkrumah, who is the father of Africa's liberation, loko va ku Africa yi free, a person like Kwame Nkrumah wale Ghana was the first one to bring that innovation ya freedom la Africa. Mara siku anga lova anga kotanga na ku lahliwa atikweni ra yena hi ku se a onhe ngopfu kumbe a dye ngopfu kumbe a dyele ngopfu a fanele ku se a lahliwa amatikweni mambe, which is really a sad state of affairs.
Kalanga,
that is Sydney Baloyi. That is Sydney Baloyi with us as we continue with our show, Love Essay. And you can gather and agree with me that from what he has been saying up to now goes to show that he is a product of reading about and listening to ideas that shape the world and events that shake the world. It's only out of reading. It is only out of being inquisitive, out of being an avid reader that he's able to speak the way he is. Some of you may be tempted to assume that he's into a political space, but he's just speaking politics. Speaking politics has got nothing to do with one being a politician. And you have heard from him that as he speaks now, He speaks from a patriotic heart. You can tell, you can read from his face, those that are able to read his face, that when he speaks about the poverty that has come to characterize Africa and the corruption that goes with our governance, he speaks from a bleeding heart, and that goes again to show that he is a relevant guest to be with us this evening. And NGOBENI, you wanted to say something, or you wanted to follow up with him, and it is time for you to go on to do just exactly that.
You know, Kalanga, well, thank you, my God. Thank you, Papa, my God. Kangala, and I can only imagine how much of our listeners would want to share in what you continue to share. But I want us to zoom into the role of media, or rather the role of broadcasting in general, when we look at the brand that is Africa. You've just highlighted now that Africa as a whole is a country that is marred with so much poverty, with so much corruption. And I would like to believe that that is not only exclusive to Africa. Other countries as well have their own challenges. I mean, we look at now recently in France, Emmanuel Macron, when he stepped down, there were issues there. Boris Johnson, when he stepped down, there were issues. There were issues with the presidency of Donald Trump. All over the world, we seem to have that kind of a challenge. But what is it that Africa is doing wrong that it brings so much into the spotlight? The corruption that continues to kind of define our borders. It kind of defines what Africa is. How much is media contributing to that in terms of picking up or pressing down the brand that is America, that is Africa?
Yeah. So thanks, Mlamzi. So Yaleo, to answer it broadly, I think it must be shelved and shifted onto the next conversation that we're going to have. But I can answer it in summary. So in the earlier years of the past century, Africa became a contested territory by two of the world's largest powers, the English and the French. And that's why if you travel to West Africa, you won't feel like you are in your own continent, because and the minute they discover you are from the southern part of Africa, they also don't feel like they are speaking to one of their own. So Mangezi namafurwa abaphakelana matikulawa hishpidi so chavisa ngofu. And when they were done with partitioning Africa, and many years later, when they were out of action and we were left to run these countries on our own, damage had long been caused. Even as we speak now, Africa is just, secluded islands of French-speaking people and English-speaking people, and in a few other areas, maybe Portuguese-speaking people.
Interesting.
And that way, it has made it a whole lot more difficult for Africans to perceive themselves as one whole. And if an opportunity exists soon, and we have to talk about this as one single-minded subject, I'll be very happy to share my views on it.
Well, I already have a topic in mind. Was Africa molested with Sydney Baloyi?
Okay, let me carry on. Sydney, If I may ask you, I'll pose a question to you, a very short one, typical of a question from a teacher. I'll assume a role of a teacher now, and I allocate just a mark for that if it were in a test situation. Does radio today, as we speak, compared to how it was when you started, still relevant or not? 1 mark.
Okay. Radio seems to be, the one single media platform that will forever be relevant. And actually, it's because I know when I got onto radio, it was just a few years before the internet, meaning that people who worked on radio then had to work 10 times harder than it was expected to get information. If you had anybody on radio then, I share any information with you. I was information yale. That person has gone on to read books or journals and so on. And now with the advent of the internet, people are able to get information real time, even whilst on air. But radio is still very relevant. If people hear something on the radio, chances are they will tell you that they believe it because they heard it on the radio.
I'm answered, and our viewers and listeners are answered. The next one, and it's about you have been in the airways for approximately you have, according to the calculation of this program, about 250 voiceovers that you made. Would you say, in terms of how it operates in the media space, that 250 or about 250 voiceovers that you made, commercials that you made, speak to the experience of what Sydney has and the influence that he has in the airwaves? Is it less? Is it more? What would you say? How would you rate yourself statistically?
It's really a difficult one. Of all the questions that you've asked me, it's really a difficult one to answer, because in a job such as this, you get to a point where you are doing it because you believe that what you are doing, it's a calling that is meant to advance some form of development to whoever is listening to you. So it's not something that you do for ratings. And thanks for the good research work that you have done. It is true that my voice has been exploited on quite a lot of platforms. It has appeared on more than 200 commercials over the years. And the reason why it could reach, such a notch, it's because from the very first one I did, the market felt that if they use a particular voice, meaning mine in this case, it would be easier to sell their product, or sell their messages, or push their agendas. But on my side, I honestly never do this job just for ratings. And that's why even with social media as hectic as it is today, if you go on social media, you'll find minimal presence and interaction that's generated by myself, because I just do my work.
That's Sydney Baloyi. Over and above the voiceovers that we are talking about now, he has been with the then Radio Toyando. He has been with Munganalonene FM. He has been with SAFM. That is the influence that he has had in the media space. So it's out of humility that he sounds like he's not convinced that he has done more in terms of the voiceovers. It is a massive achievement. I put it to him without expecting any comment from him. And having done SAFM, your talk show, having been on TV, which I want us to move on to now, what was your experience for the first time that as Tsonga-speaking people, we were blessed, privileged to have one of the golden voices of our airways being you, to break the virginity of our coverage on television?
Yeah, it was like a huge load on my shoulders. I still remember it as if it was yesterday. So when the SABC was repositioning itself to be seen as a broadcast network that covers the interests of all languages in the country, it immediately dawned on them. They did not have a single program that was being transmitted with Xitsonga or Tshivenda as medium, as languages of instruction. I so happened to be at the right place at the right time. I was already doing other programs inside the SABC on the television side. And the powers that be at the time approached me, and the late Baloyi, most people will remember her from Mubango and Giyani Land of Blood before she sadly passed away. And they asked if we could help the SABC come up with a program that would be anchored in our language, because they had nothing. And that's how we came up with a program back then, Aibitanwa Shahombe Zwantesa. And the concept was quite simple. We just wanted to expose South Africans to the fact that this language is not incidental or accidental. There are many people who are products of this language, and they are already in very influential positions around the country. It's just South Africans have been ignorant of both the language and its culture. And I remember we had such a great time traveling all over the country doing that show. And South Africans embraced the idea of having what in their view at the time was like a new language, but it was just a language that they had not allowed themselves to be exposed to. And it became the initial bedrock for many other things and programs that followed, including the current dramas such as Giyani Land of Blood that are now helping to advance the language and the culture. Yeah, Xitsonga na Vatsonga.
We would have loved to have about 2 hours of this program, but that cannot be. But at least up to now, our executive producer has extended it by half an hour. We want to believe that just for today, our executive producer will bear with us, and especially looking at how the viewers, the listeners, have been looking forward to this program, that if we extend it by another 5 minutes, that should not be too much. And then NGOBENI will be taking us into part of this remaining 5 minutes before we draw to an end of this much awaited show.
Well, thank you very much, Kalanga. Well, and I have to say today you are the fountain of knowledge, and I believe our listeners would still want to hear far much more coming from you. I want to kind of go back a little bit to your voice having been transformed into a brand. I know as a radio broadcaster, we cannot take away the intellect that is required for one to make a mark in that specific institution. But your voice on its own, as it stands, it's your bread and butter. How did you transform your voice into a brand that it is today? And how do you continue to maintain that?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of many things. It's a mixture of many experiences. Some of it I tried to share last week when we had that failed takeoff. That in my earlier days in primary school, I was the best student in the whole school, entirely the whole school. Loko swi ta ka ku recite poetry. It was just something that I took with so much vigor and passion, to a point where it became absolutely clear that there was no other student in my entire school who could delve into poetry recitals like I could. And this was quite early on in my childhood, because if you remember, I told you there's a day when a school's inspector arrived at our school with a tape recorder. It's something that is actually obsolete as we speak. It belongs to the archives. There are people who don't know what a tape recorder looks like. And I had never heard of such a thing. And the school's inspector, in his attempt to show us what that thing does, he asked if there was a student who was known for, any ad-lib recitals of anything. And the whole class obviously went for my name. Hey, Mabosha. And I didn't know what that was all about. Then I was asked to recite any of my favorite things. I recited a poem. 3 minutes after that recital, the inspector played back the tape, and I had my voice for the first time reciting a poem, an Afrikaans poem called Amakeya. And I remember being
Kalanga, we might be in trouble with our executive producer if we carry on beyond the asked extended time of 5 minutes. We are 2 minutes away from concluding, but perhaps before that, by virtues of the power that is invested in me, I need to help us to draw to an end of this beautiful edition. But perhaps asking you this question before you leave our listeners or viewers with one thing that I request that you summarize that in less than 30 seconds, but the question you can try to answer in 40 seconds or so. What makes you speak English with such a beautiful flair, the same way you speak Tsonga? When you speak Tsonga, you don't mix it up with English to try to prove a point that, look, I might be speaking Tsonga, but I can speak English. You speak Tsonga. You are one of the purists that I know when it comes to Tsonga speaking, and you are one of the purists again that I know when you speak the Queen's language.
It comes straight from the generic respect that I have harbored for languages. And I understand the power that language has and its importance.
I think you have answered it. You have answered it sufficiently. Now, what is it that you want to leave our listeners, our viewers with before we conclude?
I think all I can say to our viewers is that each one of us has a story. There is nobody that will live your story. When you wake up, live that story yourself. At the end of the day, when you rest, just press the pause button so that when you wake up tomorrow, you continue living your own story.
And Ngobeni, you are parting short as we come to an end of this show edition. Ngobeni, if you were to say something as we part ways with our listeners, we seem to be having a problem with Ngobeni. This is again our way of saying to you that we are grateful for what you have been doing, that is staying tuned, for your time that you decided to spend with us this evening. And we want to thank our guest, Mabosha, Sydney Baloyi. And we know that somebody learned something today, somebody got encouraged, somebody got to learn more about Sydney, who deliberately stayed away from getting into what he does. We were not here to give you what you know of him, but something that you are not much familiar of about him. And I think we delivered in that respect. And this brings an end to this long-awaited edition with Sydney Mabosha, the legendary broadcaster. And we can only pray, hope, and do our fasting in our corners that we get him back in full swing in our airwaves. Thank you, Sydney. And that brings us to an end of being with you, and hope to be with you sometime in the future, as we believe that there's a lot that we still need to talk to you in other areas of what you have been doing to this beautiful country, Mzansi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Streaming 24/7.
24/7.
Bold Moves Radio.
Bold Moves Radio.
Afrika, nakupenda sana. Oh, Afrika, nakupenda sana.